Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the dust of the trail often covers secrets that were meant to stay buried forever. Tonight's story isn't about a lost gold mine or a notorious gunslinger's last stand. It's about a lost piece of paper, a letter penned by a grieving widow, whose forgotten words held the power to unearth a generation of lies and ignite a war for the very soul of a valley. So draw close, listen to the whisper of the wind, and hear the story of a promise made to the dead, a tale we call The Widow's Ledger. The Whispering Willows Valley was a secret the rest of the West had thankfully forgotten. It was a place carved out by the patient, meandering hand of the Serenity River, a lush green sanctuary nestled between the harsh, sun-scorched badlands to the south and impassive granite peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains to the north. Unlike the boom towns that chased the fleeting promise of gold and silver, the valley's wealth was quiet, honest, and deep. It was in the rich, black soil of the river basin, in the clear, cold water that tumbled down from the mountain snows, and in the deep-rooted peace of the families who had called this place home for a generation. Caleb Riley was a newcomer to this peace, and he cherished it like a man who had known thirst his whole life and had finally found a fresh, clean spring. He was young, barely 22, with a strong back, hands calloused from honest work, and a quiet, hopeful nature that had somehow survived a childhood spent in the crowded, dirty orphanages of the East. He had come west not seeking a fortune, but a home, a small piece of earth to call his own. A year ago, he had used every last cent he had to buy the old, abandoned Miller Plessis 100 acres of prime river bottom land with a small, dilapidated cabin that had been empty for the better part of a decade. For 12 months, Caleb had poured his sweat and his soul into the land. He had repaired the cabin, mended the fences, and cleared the fields that had been reclaimed by wild grasses and stubborn mesquite. He was a builder, a nurturer, and he felt a profound, almost spiritual connection to this quiet corner of the world. He was putting down roots, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. This day was a day for endings and beginnings. He was finally tackling the last, most stubborn part of his property, a thick, tangled stand of old willow trees and dense undergrowth right on the riverbank, a section the previous owners had never bothered to clear. His plan was to turn it into a pasture for the small herd of cattle he dreamed of one day owning. The work was brutal. The air was thick and humid, and the sun, when it broke through the dense canopy of leaves, was hot and unforgiving. He worked with an axe and a brush hook, his shirt soaked with sweat, his muscles screaming in protest. It was in the late afternoon, as he was trying to pry the roots of a particularly ancient, gnarled willow from the soft, damp earth, that his shovel struck something hard. It wasn't the dull thud of a rock, but a hollow, splintering sound. Curious, he dropped his shovel and began to dig with his hands, clearing away the rich, dark soil and the tangle of roots. He unearthed a small, rotting wooden chest, bound with rusted iron straps. It was heavy, and its wood was so waterlogged and decayed that it began to crumble in his hands as he lifted it from its shallow grave. It had clearly been buried here for a very, very long time. With a final heave, he pulled it free and set it on the riverbank. The lock was a single, rusted piece of metal that flaked away at his touch. With a sense of unearthing a long-forgotten secret, he pried the lid open. The contents were not gold or jewels. The chest was filled with a collection of seemingly random, personal effects, preserved from the damp by a thick layer of oilcloth. There was a small, silver-backed locket containing a faded tintype of a handsome, serious-looking man with a thick mustache. There was a child's small, hand-carved wooden horse. And at the bottom, wrapped in another layer of oilcloth, was a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The envelopes were addressed in an elegant, spidery script to a Mr. Samuel Thompson. The letters inside, however, were not from a distant relative or friend. They were from his wife. Caleb sat on the riverbank, the sounds of the gurgling water and the whispering willows around him, and began to read. Most of the letters were simple, beautiful expressions of love and daily life, a wife sharing the small moments of her day with a husband who was away on business. They spoke of their son, Elias, of the crops, of the community. But the final letter, the one on the very bottom, was different. Its paper was of a finer quality, and it was sealed not in an envelope, but with a single drop of dark red wax. The date on it was from nearly 20 years ago. The handwriting was the same, but it was frantic, hurried, the elegant script now a desperate scrawl. It was not addressed to a living man. It was a letter to the dead. My dearest Samuel, it began. I pray this letter finds you in the arms of the Lord, though my heart breaks to know I am writing to a ghost. They have told the valley that your death was an accident, a terrible fall in the mountains. But I know the truth, my love. I know it was murder. You found their secret, the one that lies beneath our beautiful valley, and for that, they silenced you. Silas Blackwood came to me today. He did not offer condolences. He offered a warning. He said that for the sake of our son, Elias, I must keep my silence. He said that you were a fool who stood in the way of progress. He smiled when he said it, Samuel. That terrible, predatory smile. I am a coward. I will do as he says, for I cannot bear to lose our son as I have lost you. But I cannot let his evil go unrecorded. I cannot let your death be a lie. And so, I am writing this down, a final testament to the truth. Blackwood is not the benevolent founder he pretends to be. He is a serpent. He and his partners, the ones who smile at us in church on Sunday, are systematically trying to steal this valley from the families who bled to create it. They are using the law, the bank, and the threat of violence to break us, one by one. You discovered their plan, their true reason for wanting this land, and it cost you your life. I do not know who will ever read this. I am burying it here, by our special place on the river, along with the things that matter most. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the truth has remained buried with me. I beg you, do not let our valley, the home we built, fall into the hands of these wicked men. Do not let the memory of Samuel Thompson be forgotten. Do not let them win. For the love of God, and for the future of our son, fight for this land. It is a good land, and it is worth fighting for. Forever yours, in this life and the next. Eliza May Thompson. Caleb sat there, the brittle paper trembling in his hand, a cold dread washing over him that had nothing to do with the setting sun. Silas Blackwood was still the most powerful man in the valley, a pillar of the community, owner of the bank and half the land. Elias Thompson, the son mentioned in the letter, was a respected, quiet farmer, a man known for his gentle nature and his avoidance of conflict. The valley that Caleb had come to love, his sanctuary, was built on a foundation of murder, conspiracy, and lies. He had not just been clearing a pasture, he had been digging up a grave. And with the unearthing of this single, forgotten letter, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just unearthed a war. The quiet peace of Whispering Willows Valley was a beautiful, fragile lie, and he was now the sole keeper of the terrible, dangerous truth. The widow's words, crying out from the dust of 2 decades, had just changed everything. Caleb Riley carried the widow's letter back to his small, lonely cabin like a man carrying a live bomb. The words on the brittle, yellowed paper had shattered the peaceful world he had so carefully constructed for himself. His quiet valley was not a sanctuary, it was a crime scene. His powerful and respected neighbor, Silas Blackwood, was not a benevolent patriarch, he was a murderer and a thief. Every friendly nod from a neighbor, every familiar landmark, now seemed tainted by the shadow of this 2-decade-old conspiracy. For 2 days, Caleb was paralyzed by a crisis of conscience. He was a newcomer, an outsider with no standing in the community. To bring this letter forward would be to accuse the most powerful man in the valley of the most heinous of crimes. Who would believe him, a landless orphan, over the man who owned the bank, who sat on the church council, and who held the mortgages on half the farms in the valley? To speak out would be to paint a target on his own back. The letter was a death sentence, either for the truth, or for the man who dared to speak it. He thought of reburying the chest, of throwing the letter into the river and forgetting he had ever seen it. It was the sensible, safe thing to do. He had come here seeking peace, not to fight a war that had ended before he was even born. But he could not escape the haunting plea in Eliza Thompson's words, do not let them win. Fight for this land. He had fallen in love with this valley, with its quiet beauty and the promise of a life he had never had. He could not, in good conscience, stand by and be a silent party to the lie it was built upon. The true and rightful heir to this knowledge, he knew, was the man mentioned in the letter of Eliza's son, Elias Thompson. Elias was a man in his early 30s, known throughout the valley for his quiet, gentle nature. He was the antithesis of the typical Western archetype. He was a farmer, a scholar, and a man who had never been known to raise his voice, let alone a weapon. He had inherited his father's farm, but not, it seemed, his father's fighting spirit. He was a good man, a decent man, but a man who deliberately kept to the shadows, as if trying to avoid the notice of the world. With a heavy heart and the fateful letter tucked inside his shirt, Caleb rode to the Thompson homestead. It was one of the oldest and most prosperous farms in the valley, a testament to the hard work of Elias's parents. Elias was in his barn, mending a piece of harness, when Caleb arrived. "Caleb," Elias said, a small, friendly smile on his face. "Good to see you. What brings you out this way?" Caleb, his throat dry, did not waste time with pleasantries. "I found something, Elias," he said, his voice low. "On my land. By the river. I think you need to see it." He laid the locket, the small wooden horse, and the stack of letters on a hay bale. Elias looked at the items, his brow furrowed in confusion. He picked up the locket and opened it. He stared at the faded image of his father, a man he had only known through stories, and a single, formal portrait that hung in his living room. "This was my father's," he whispered, a look of dawning wonder on his face. "And this," he said, picking up the small, worn horse, "my mother told me he carved this for me, the week before his accident." Then, Caleb handed him the final, sealed letter. "She wrote this, too," he said quietly. Elias broke the wax seal and began to read. Caleb watched as the color drained from the man's face. The quiet, gentle farmer seemed to shrink before his eyes, the weight of his mother's words, of a 2-decade-old murder, pressing down on him. When he finished reading, he did not speak. He simply sat down on the hay bale, the letter trembling in his hand, his eyes wide with a look of profound, horrified shock. The official story of his life, the narrative of a father lost to a tragic accident and a mother who had died of a broken heart a year later, had been a lie. He was the son of a murdered hero and a terrified, silenced woman. "Blackwood," Elias whispered, the name a venomous, disbelieving hiss. "All these years, he's been a friend to me, a mentor. He helped me when my mother passed. He gave the eulogy at her funeral. The betrayal was so deep, so monstrous, that it was almost impossible to comprehend." The two men sat in the silence of the barn for a long time, the world outside continuing on, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shattered the foundations of their valley. "What do we do?" Caleb finally asked. Elias looked up, and in his eyes, Caleb saw not the gentle farmer, but a man drowning in a sea of grief, fear, and a terrible, unfamiliar rage. "I don't know," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. This changes everything. He owns half this valley. The sheriff is his cousin. The judge who signs the deeds is his business partner. We are 2 men against an empire." The news of the letter, as all such secrets do in small towns, began to leak out. It started not with a bang, but a whisper. Caleb, seeking advice, confided in the one man he thought he could trust, the valley's old, semi-retired doctor. A man who had been there for a generation and seemed to dislike Blackwood's overbearing influence. The doctor, in turn, spoke to a trusted friend. Within a week, the story of the widow's letter was a low, dangerous murmur in the saloons and general stores, a piece of explosive gossip that was spreading like a prairie fire. The valley began to divide. The lines were drawn not between good and evil, but between fear and courage, between those who were indebted to Silas Blackwood and those who were independent enough to resent his power. The older families, the ones who had been in the valley as long as the Thompsons, began to look at each other with suspicion. Who among them had been Blackwood's partners? Who had profited from the death of Samuel Thompson? Old friendships became strained. Long-simmering resentments boiled to the surface. Silas Blackwood reacted to the rumors with a display of calm, dismissive authority. He called a public meeting in the town square. He stood on the steps of the bank he owned, a pillar of respectable society, and he laughed at the stories. "I have heard these fantastic rumors," he said, his voice booming and confident. "These whispers from the grave, supposedly unearthed by a rootless newcomer. It is the stuff of dime novels, not reality. Samuel Thompson was my friend. His death was a tragedy that this valley has mourned for 20 years. To desecrate his memory with these wild, unsubstantiated accusations is a sin against this entire community." He looked out at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them, a subtle reminder of the power he held, of the mortgages he owned, of the favors he could grant or withhold. "This is a distraction," he declared, "an attempt by outside agitators to sow discord in our peaceful valley. I urge you all to dismiss these foolish, dangerous lies and return to the good, honest work that has made this valley the jewel of the territory." His performance was masterful. For many, his words were a reassurance, a return to the comfortable status quo. But for others, the ones who had always harbored a secret resentment of his power, his denial was too quick, too smooth. They saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a cold, reptilian anger behind the mask of benevolent concern. The letter had become a catalyst, forcing everyone to choose a side. The valley was no longer a peaceful sanctuary. It was a cold war, fought in whispers, in averted gazes, and in the sudden, chilling realization that your oldest friend might be your most dangerous enemy. And at the center of it all were Caleb Riley, the newcomer who had become an accidental revolutionary, and Elias Thompson, the gentle farmer who was now faced with a terrible, unavoidable choice: to remain in the shadows and let his father's murder go unavenged, or to step into the light and claim the dangerous, bloody legacy that his mother's letter had just laid at his feet. The weight of his parents' legacy was a crushing burden for Elias Thompson. He was a man of the soil, not of the gun. His hands were skilled at coaxing life from the earth, not at taking it. The idea of confronting Silas Blackwood, a man who was not only a murderer but also a powerful, almost father-like figure in his life, was a terrifying, paralyzing prospect. He retreated into himself, the letter locked away, his days spent in a haze of grief and indecision. The fire of rage that had been kindled by his mother's words was being smothered by a lifetime of ingrained pacifism and fear. It was Caleb who refused to let the matter die. He saw the fear and division that Blackwood's speech had sown in the valley. He knew that if they did nothing, the truth would be reburied, this time forever, and Blackwood's reign would be more absolute than ever. "He's winning, Elias," Caleb said, confronting the farmer in his barn a few days after the town meeting. "He's making people believe that we are the threat, that the truth is the real danger. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." "What can we do?" Elias asked, his voice full of a weary despair. "He has the law, the money, and the guns. We have a letter." "We have more than that," Caleb insisted. "We have the truth. And we have the families who are not in his pocket, the ones who are just as scared as we are, but who are tired of living under his thumb." Caleb began to act as the reluctant leader of the burgeoning opposition. He started to meet in secret with the heads of the other independent families, the grizzled, stubborn patriarch of the McBride clan, the two hot-headed sons of the Rodriguez family, whose lands bordered Blackwood's. These were proud, hard-working people who had long resented Blackwood's creeping control over the valley. The letter had given their resentment a name and a focus. Their early attempts at resistance were small and disorganized. They tried to form a concerned citizens committee to petition the territorial governor, but their letter was intercepted and lost by the postmaster, another of Blackwood's men. They tried to organize a boycott of Blackwood's bank and mercantile, but Blackwood simply called in the debts of those who participated, crushing the boycott before it could even begin. With every failed attempt, Blackwood's power seemed to grow, and the morale of the small resistance group dwindled. They were farmers, not politicians or warriors, and they were being systematically outmaneuvered. The turning point came not from a plan, but from an act of simple, brutish intimidation. One of the Rodriguez boys, a fiery young man named Mateo, got into a drunken argument with two of Blackwood's hired guns in the saloon. The argument was about the letter. Words escalated to shoves, and shoves to fists. Mateo, a capable brawler, was holding his own until one of the thugs, a man named Larkin, drew his pistol and, in a fair fight, shot the unarmed boy in the leg, crippling him. The sheriff, Blackwood's cousin, ruled it a case of self-defense. The entire valley knew it was a lie. It was a message, a clear and brutal demonstration of what happened to those who spoke out too loudly. That night, Elias Thompson stood at his window, looking out at the dark, silent valley. He had heard about Mateo. He knew the boy would likely never walk properly again. He thought of his mother's letter, of her plea to protect the valley. He thought of his father, a man who had been murdered for standing up to these very same men. And he felt a profound, burning shame. His inaction, his fear, had allowed this to happen. His pacifism was not a virtue, it was a form of cowardice, and other people were paying the price for it. He walked to the heavy oak chest that had belonged to his father. He opened it. Beneath a collection of old clothes and family papers was a long, leather-wrapped object. He unwrapped it. It was his father's rifle, a heavy, long-barreled Sharps, a gun made for hunting buffalo and men. He had never fired it in his life. Beside it was a gun belt, with a well-worn Colt Peacemaker in the holster. He picked up the gun belt. The leather was stiff, the gun heavy and cold. It felt alien in his hand, a tool of a world he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. He strapped it on. The weight of it on his hip was a strange and terrible thing. It felt like a betrayal of everything he was, but also, in a way that frightened him, like a homecoming. He was his father's son, and the time for plowing was over. The time for fighting had begun. The next morning, a new man rode out from the Thompson homestead. Elias Thompson, the quiet scholar, the gentle farmer, was gone. In his place was a grim-faced man with a rifle in his saddle scabbard and his father's Colt on his hip. He rode not to his fields, but to the Rodriguez ranch. He found the family gathered, their faces a mixture of grief and impotent rage. He dismounted and walked to the patriarch of the family. "I am sorry for your son," Elias said, his voice quiet but clear, with a new, hard edge to it. "And I am sorry for my own fear, which has allowed this to happen." He looked at the faces of the assembled men, the McBrides, the other families who had tried to fight and failed. "Blackwood thinks he has broken us. He thinks that by crippling one of us, he has silenced us all. He is wrong. He has only shown us that his language is not one of reason, but of violence. It is time we learned to speak his language." He was not a charismatic leader. He did not give a fiery speech. But in his eyes, they saw a change. They saw the quiet resolve of a man who had crossed a line in his own soul, a man who had finally accepted his legacy. His quiet, reluctant courage was more powerful than any loud bravado. Under Elias's new, hesitant leadership, the resistance was reborn. It was no longer a committee of concerned citizens. It was a war council. They knew they could not win a direct, open fight. Blackwood had too many men, too many guns. They had to be smarter. They had to use their knowledge of the valley, their skills as ranchers and farmers, as weapons. Their new strategy was one of attrition and psychological warfare. They started by disrupting Blackwood's operations. A key piece of machinery at his lumber mill would accidentally break. A herd of his prize cattle would be spooked during the night, scattered for miles across the high country. A supply wagon heading to his ranch would find a bridge washed out, its route delayed by days. These were small acts, pinpricks, but they were constant and unnerving. Blackwood, who had expected a cowed and silent valley, found himself fighting a phantom insurgency. He couldn't prove who was responsible, and his hired guns were useless against an enemy they couldn't see. His frustration grew, and his mask of benevolent control began to slip, revealing the angry, impatient tyrant beneath. Elias, for his part, was a natural strategist. The same meticulous, patient mind that had made him a successful farmer was now applied to the art of guerrilla warfare. He was not a natural gunman, and he knew it. He spent his nights practicing with his father's Colt, the loud reports echoing in the lonely darkness, a sound of a man at war with himself as much as with his enemies. He was still a reluctant gun, but he was a gun nonetheless. And he was slowly, methodically, beginning to prove that the son of Samuel Thompson was a man that Silas Blackwood should have feared all along. The valley became a chessboard, and Elias Thompson, the quiet farmer, revealed himself to be a surprisingly adept player. The war for the Whispering Willows was fought not in the streets, but in the shadows, not with volleys of rifle fire, but with stolen livestock, sabotaged equipment, and a relentless campaign of psychological pressure. Elias's strategy was simple but effective. He would not attack Blackwood's strength, his army of hired guns. He would attack his wealth, his operations, the very foundations of his power. He and his small band of rebel scaled, the McBrides, the Rodriguez family become ghosts in their own land. They used their intimate knowledge of the valley's terrain to move unseen, striking at Blackwood's assets and melting back into the hills before his men could react. They drove a herd of wild mustangs through one of Blackwood's prime pastures, the sharp hooves of the untamed horses churning the valuable grazing land into a muddy ruin. They used their knowledge of irrigation to divert a small, crucial creek, leaving Blackwood's own fields parched and dry while their own remained lush and green. They started a rumor in a nearby town that a cattle disease had broken out in the valley, causing the price of Blackwood's beef to plummet at the stockyards. Each act was a carefully calculated blow against Blackwood's empire, designed to cost him money and erode his authority. The hired guns he had employed, men who had signed on for the easy work of intimidating unarmed farmers, found themselves guarding fences and chasing phantoms in the dark. Their morale began to plummet. They were fighters, not farmhands, and this war of whispers and shadows was unnerving and deeply frustrating. Silas Blackwood, a man used to absolute control, was slowly being driven into a state of paranoid fury. He was a king under siege in his own castle, his wealth bleeding away, his enemy an intangible, ever-present force. He began to make mistakes. He doubled the number of guards, stretching his resources thin. He imposed a curfew on the town and began to harass innocent families, his frustration boiling over into open tyranny. His actions only served to alienate the neutral townspeople, pushing more and more of them to sympathize with the rebels. The widow's letter was the silent heart of the conflict. Elias and Caleb had made several copies. At night, a copy would be nailed to the church door or to the door of the saloon. Blackwood's men would tear it down, but the next day, another would appear. The words of Eliza Thompson, her tale of murder and betrayal, became a constant, damning accusation that Blackwood could not escape. The truth, once unearthed, refused to be reburied. The true genius of Elias's strategy, however, was in the intelligence he gathered. He knew that to win, he needed more than just a series of successful raids. He needed to find the one thing that would destroy Blackwood completely, proof of the murder of his father. He needed to find the secret that Eliza had mentioned in her letter, the true reason Blackwood was so desperate to control the valley. Caleb, the outsider, became his chief spy. Because he was a relative newcomer, he was not as well known to Blackwood's men. He began to spend his evenings in the saloon in the main town, a place the valley farmers usually avoided. He would sit in a dark corner, nursing a single beer for hours, listening to the loose talk of Blackwood's frustrated and increasingly drunken hired guns. It was a dangerous game. But Caleb, driven by his own sense of justice and his fierce loyalty to Elias and the valley, played his part well. He was the quiet, unassuming man that nobody noticed, and he began to piece together the puzzle. He learned the names of Blackwood's inner circle. He learned of a secret, weekly delivery of heavily guarded wagons that came not to the ranch, but to an old, abandoned mine deep in the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. A mine that had supposedly been played out for years. The mine. This had to be the secret. Elias knew that a direct assault on the mine was impossible. It would be too heavily guarded. He needed to get inside, to find the proof he needed without alerting Blackwood. He, Caleb, and the two Rodriguez sons, who were young and agile, planned a daring infiltration. Using their skills as horsemen and their knowledge of the treacherous mountain terrain, they made a perilous nighttime journey, avoiding the main trails and the watchful eyes of Blackwood's patrols. They reached the area of the abandoned mine, a desolate, windswept place high in the mountains. The entrance to the mine was guarded by a half-dozen of Blackwood's most trusted men, camped out in a small cabin. The four rebels did not attack. They waited, hidden in the rocks, for 2 days, their patience a thing of honed, disciplined steel. They watched, and they learned. They saw that the real activity was not at the main entrance, but at a smaller, hidden ventilation shaft, halfway up a sheer cliff face. It was here that the secret deliveries were being winched down into the earth. The secret was not something being brought to the mine. It was something being brought out. On the third night, under the cover of a brewing storm, Elias and Caleb made their move. While the Rodriguez brothers created a small diversion or rock slide on the far side of the mountain, they made the difficult, dangerous climb up the cliff face to the ventilation shaft. They lowered themselves down into the darkness on a rope, their hearts pounding. The shaft opened into a dark, cavernous space that was not a mine tunnel at all. It was a massive, underground vault, its walls reinforced with heavy timbers. And the vault was filled not with gold or silver, but with something far more valuable and far more illegal: guns. Crates upon crates of new, repeating rifles, cases of ammunition, and several Gatling guns, all bearing the markings of the United States Army. The truth, and all its treasonous horror, was finally revealed. Silas Blackwood was not just a land thief. He was an arms dealer, secretly supplying weapons to revolutionary factions in Mexico, and likely to renegade Indian tribes, using the valley as his hidden, untouchable base of operations. The progress he had spoken of was the progress of a private, illegal war. Samuel Thompson had discovered this secret, and for that, he had been murdered. The valley was not just a prize, it was the key to a criminal enterprise of a massive, international scale. Elias and Caleb stood in the silent vault, the scale of Blackwood's evil washing over them. They now had the proof they needed, a truth so explosive it would not just destroy Blackwood, but could potentially embroil the entire territory in a scandal. But they were trapped, deep under the earth, in the heart of the serpent's nest. And they had no way of knowing if they would ever be able to bring this terrible secret to the light. Trapped deep within the earth, surrounded by the evidence of Silas Blackwood's treason, Elias and Caleb knew that their discovery was both a victory and a potential death sentence. They had found the truth, but they were in the heart of the enemy's fortress. The air in the underground vault was cold and still, thick with the smell of gun oil and damp stone. Their first instinct was to escape, to get this explosive information back to the valley and then to the territorial authorities. But as they scouted the edges of the vast cavern, they realized the difficulty of their position. The only way out they knew of was the ventilation shaft they had come down, a perilous climb that would be impossible in a hurry. The main tunnel entrance, they assumed, would lead directly to the guards' camp. It was Elias, his farmer's mind always analyzing the structure of things, who noticed the anomaly. At the far end of the vault, partially hidden behind a stack of rifle crates, was a section of the rock wall that seemed different. It was smoother, more uniform, and there were faint, almost invisible seams that suggested a hidden door. Prying at the edges with a crowbar they found in the cavern, they managed to swing open a heavy, timber-reinforced section of the wall, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. This was not a mine shaft. It was a purpose-built escape route. It was Blackwood's personal back door, a testament to the man's cunning and paranoia. With a shared look of grim determination, they knew this was their only chance. They lit a lantern and plunged into the darkness, the tunnel sloping gently downward, deeper into the mountain. The tunnel twisted and turned for what felt like miles, a claustrophobic, silent journey. It finally ended at another heavy, wooden door. Listening intently, they could hear the faint, distant sound of running water. With extreme caution, they eased the door open and found themselves in a natural cave. They were fresh and cool. A small, underground stream trickled through the cave, and a faint, pale light filtered in from an opening high above. They had found their way out. The escape tunnel emerged in a hidden, box canyon, several miles from the mine itself. They were free, but their ordeal was not over. As they made their way back toward the valley, keeping to the high, rugged terrain, they saw the signs that they had been discovered. Signal fires burned on the distant peaks, and they could see Riders Blackwood's men fawning out, sweeping the hills. Their infiltration of the vault had been uncovered. Blackwood now knew that his secret was out. The war of whispers and shadows was over. Blackwood could no longer rely on subtle intimidation. He was a cornered, desperate man, and he would now unleash the full, brutal force of his private army to crush the rebellion and silence the witnesses forever. They arrived back at their secret camp to find their small band of rebels in a state of near panic. The Rodriguez brothers, who had been waiting for them, reported that Blackwood's men were sweeping the valley, rounding up anyone suspected of being a sympathizer. Blackwood had declared a state of martial law, his hired guns now a brutal occupying army. Elias Thompson, the reluctant gun, now faced the ultimate test of his leadership. The time for clever sabotage was past. A final, open confrontation was now inevitable. He gathered his small, terrified group of farmers. "He knows," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying a new, hard authority. "He knows that we have found his secret. He will not stop until every one of us, and our families, are dead. He has left us no choice. We can no longer hide. We must fight." "Fight," one of the McBride boys exclaimed. "Fight who?" "His whole damn army. They'll slaughter us." "We will not fight him on his terms," Elias said, his eyes burning with a cold, strategic fire. He unrolled a crude, hand-drawn map of the valley. "We will not wait for him to come to us. We will force him to a place of our choosing. A place where his numbers are a weakness, not a strength. His finger fell on a spot on the map marked Blackwood Gorge. It was a narrow, treacherous canyon that formed the valley's southern boundary, the only route by which a large force could bring in wagons and heavy equipment. We will make our stand here, Elias declared. We will turn the gorge into a trap. We will use his own weapons against him. The plan was one of audacious, almost suicidal bravery. They would send a small party, led by Caleb, back to the hidden mine, not to fight, but to steal. Their target was the dynamite. While Elias and the rest of the farmers prepared the gorge for an ambush, Caleb's team would conduct a daring nighttime raid to acquire the one weapon that could even the odds. It was a desperate, final gamble. The farmers, their faces a mixture of terror and a new, grim resolve, looked at the quiet man who had become their leader. They saw the son of Samuel Thompson, and they saw a man who was willing to die for their shared home. One by one, they nodded their assent. The serpent's nest had been breached, and now, the final, bloody battle for the Whispering Willows Valley was about to be joined. The raid on the mine was a mission fueled by pure, desperate nerve. Caleb, the two Rodriguez sons, and two of the hardiest McBride boys made their way back into the Dragon's Tooth Mountains under the cover of a moonless, stormy night. The wind howled through the peaks, a mournful symphony that both masked their approach and amplified the tension in their hearts. They found the mine complex on high alert, the guards doubled, their campfires burning brightly against the oppressive darkness. A direct assault on the vault was impossible. But Elias's plan did not call for a direct assault. It was a plan of deception and misdirection, designed by a farmer who understood the logic of irrigation and the flow of natural forces. Their target was not the vault itself, but the stream that flowed from the escape tunnel's cave. While the Rodriguez boys created a noisy diversion high on the ridge, throwing rocks and firing their rifles sporadically to draw the guards' attention, Caleb and the McBrides made their way to the hidden box canyon. They carried with them empty canvas water bags and a small, hand-crank pump. The work was grueling and silent. For hours, they pumped water from the stream, diverting its flow not into the canyon, but into the mouth of the escape tunnel. It was a slow, painstaking process, turning the tunnel into a crude, man-made pipeline. They were flooding the vault from the bottom up. Their hope was that the rising water would damage the crates of rifles, but more importantly, that it would destabilize the cases of old, volatile dynamite stored at the lowest level. They were not trying to steal the explosives, they were trying to turn Blackwood's own armory into a massive, self-destructing bomb. Up at the guard camp, the diversion and the storm had the desired effect. The guards were nervous and distracted, their attention focused on the phantom attackers on the ridge. No one noticed the water level in the vault slowly, silently rising. The explosion, when it came, was not a sharp, cracking sound, but a deep, guttural, subterranean roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. It was followed by a massive plume of smoke and dust that erupted from the main mine entrance, and, more tellingly, from the ventilation shaft high on the cliff face. Caleb and his men, watching from a safe distance, felt the earth tremble beneath their feet. They had done it. They had destroyed the bulk of Blackwood's arsenal, turning his greatest asset into his greatest liability. The news of the explosion at the mine sent a shockwave through Blackwood's forces. He had not only lost his secret weapon cache, but the very existence of the illegal arms smuggling operation was now revealed for all to see. He could no longer hide behind the pretense of being a simple rancher. He was an exposed traitor, a man with nothing left to lose. Enraged and cornered, he made the final, fatal mistake that Elias had been counting on. He abandoned all pretense of strategy and gathered his remaining fortress, a small army of around 40 hired guns, for a single, brutal, punitive strike. His goal was no longer to control the valley, but to obliterate it, to burn it to the ground and slaughter every man, woman, and child in it as a final, terrible act of spite. He loaded his men and their remaining supplies onto a train of wagons and began the march toward the heart of the valley. And his route, as Elias had predicted, took him directly into Blackwood Gorge. The gorge was a natural kill box, a narrow, winding canyon with high, rocky walls. Elias and his 10 farmers had spent the past 2 days preparing it for their guests. They had felled trees, creating roadblocks. They had loosened boulders, creating choke points and potential rock slides. They were not soldiers in a trench, they were hunters, and they had prepared their trap with a farmer's meticulous care. They took up their positions high in the rocks, overlooking the canyon floor. Their old hunting rifles and the few weapons they had captured their only defense against Blackwood's superior numbers and firepower. They were outnumbered for 2-1. But they were on their home ground, and they were fighting with the ferocious courage of men with their backs to the wall. As Blackwood's column of riders and wagons entered the gorge, they found the going slow and difficult. The first roadblock forced them to dismount, their horses and wagons a chaotic, jumbled mess in the narrow space. It was then that Elias gave the signal. From high on the canyon rim, a single, massive boulder, pried loose by 3 men, came crashing down, sealing the entrance to the gorge. Blackwood and his army were trapped. From the rocks on both sides of the canyon, the farmers opened fire. Their first volley was not aimed at the men, but at the lead wagon, the one carrying the spare ammunition. The wagon erupted in a secondary explosion of its own, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, sending shrapnel and panicked horses tearing through the ranks of the hired guns. Chaos reigned. The professional gunmen, caught in a perfect crossfire, with no room to maneuver and their escape route cut off, were thrown into a state of panic. The battle for Whispering Willows Valley had begun, a desperate, bloody confrontation between a small band of farmers and a private army, with the fate of their world hanging in the balance. Elias Thompson, the reluctant gun, lay on a high ledge, his father's Sharps rifle pressed to his cheek. He took careful aim at the chaos below, his heart cold and steady. The promise he had made to his mother's memory was about to be forged in gunpowder and dynamite. The battle in Blackwood Gorge was a brutal, chaotic, and desperate affair. It was not a fight of organized lines and tactical maneuvers, but a primordial brawl in a claustrophobic space. Blackwood's hired guns were professionals, but they were accustomed to fighting in open streets or saloons, where a quick draw was king. Here, in the rock-strewn, narrow confines of the gorge, their superior numbers were a liability, bunching them together, creating easy targets for the hidden riflemen above. Elias and his farmers fought with a cold, desperate fury. They were not soldiers, but they were marksmen, men who had spent their lives hunting deer and elk in these very same hills. Their shots were slow, deliberate, and devastatingly accurate. They made every bullet count, conserving their precious ammunition, while Blackwood's men fired wildly at the unseen phantoms in the rocks. Caleb Riley, fighting alongside the McBride boys, proved to be a natural warrior. His quiet, gentle nature was replaced by a grim, focused intensity. He moved with an agility and a purpose that surprised everyone, his rifle a constant, barking threat from the northern rim of the canyon. But the true leader was Elias. He moved between the small, scattered positions of his men, his presence a calming, steadying force. He was no longer the reluctant gun. He was a commander, his mind clear and sharp amidst the chaos, his orders crisp and precise. He directed their fire, pointed out targets, and seemed to anticipate the enemy's every move. He was seeing the battlefield as he saw his fields, understanding its contours, its weaknesses, and its strengths. Silas Blackwood, trapped on the canyon floor, was a man undone. His army was being decimated, his authority shattered. He roared orders, but his voice was lost in the din of gunfire and the screams of the wounded. The tyrant, the master manipulator, was reduced to just another terrified man, huddled behind an overturned wagon, as his world came crashing down around him. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The canyon floor became a slaughterhouse, the ground littered with the bodies of men and horses. The rebels took casualties of their own. One of the McBride boys was killed by a stray bullet, and old Mateo Rodriguez was gravely wounded. But they held their ground. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the mountain peaks, casting long, bloody shadows across the gorge, the will of Blackwood's remaining men finally broke. They were not fighting for a home, for a belief. They were fighting for a paycheck, and the price had become too high. They began to throw down their weapons, to surrender, to flee back toward the blocked entrance of the canyon. It was then that Blackwood, in a final, insane act of defiance, made his last move. He and a handful of his most loyal, die-hard thugs used the chaos of the surrender to fight their way forward, deeper into the canyon, toward the far exit and the open valley beyond. Elias saw them go. He knew that if Blackwood escaped, this would all have been for nothing. The man was too powerful, too connected. He would regroup, he would bring in more men, and the war would continue until the valley was completely destroyed. "He's getting away," Caleb yelled from his position. "No, he's not," Elias said, his voice a low, grim promise. He turned to the remaining farmers. "It's over here. Tend to the wounded. Secure the prisoners." Then, he, Caleb, and the two Rodriguez sons, who were fighting with a cold fury for their injured father, abandoned their high perches and descended to the canyon floor. The four of them began to pursue Blackwood, a final, desperate chase through the carnage. They caught up to them at the mouth of the gorge, where the narrow canyon opened up into the peaceful, sunlit plains of the valley. Blackwood and his three remaining men had made a stand behind a small outcropping of rock. The final confrontation was not a battle, it was an execution. There were no more ambushes, no more tactics. It was for men against for men, a straight-up gunfight under the harsh and forgiving light of the setting sun. The Rodriguez sons, their faces masks of cold rage, fought with a reckless, focused bravery, their bullets tearing into the thugs who had crippled their brother. Caleb, his movements cool and efficient, provided a steady, covering fire. And Elias was transformed. He moved with a grace and a certainty that was terrifying. He held his father's Colt Peacemaker in a steady, two-handed grip, and he did not miss. He was no longer a farmer playing the part of a soldier. He was the living embodiment of his father's legacy, the final, avenging hand of a justice that had been delayed for 20 years. The last of Blackwood's thugs fell, and only the man himself was left. He stood alone, his fine suit torn and stained with dirt and blood, his face a mask of primal, cornered animal terror. He fumbled to reload his pistol, his hands shaking. Elias walked slowly toward him, across the open ground. He stopped 20 feet away. The two men faced each other, the quiet farmer and the powerful tyrant, the sons of the two men who had started this war a generation ago. "It's over, Blackwood," Elias said, his voice calm, the Colt held steady. Blackwood raised his pistol, a final, futile act of defiance. Before he could fire, a single shot rang out, not from Elias's Colt, but from the Sharp's rifle in Caleb's hands, 100 yards away. Caleb had been watching, waiting, the silent guardian. The heavy rifle slug took Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying from his nerveless grasp. He collapsed to his knees, wounded and defeated. Elias walked forward and stood over the man who had murdered his father and terrorized his home. He looked down at the pathetic, whimpering figure. He could kill him. It would be so easy. It would be justice. But as he looked into Blackwood's terrified eyes, he saw not a monster, but just a broken, greedy old man. He thought of his father, of the good and decent man he had been. He thought of his mother's letter, of her plea to fight for the valley. He had fought. He had won. And now, he had a choice. To become a killer, just like Blackwood, or to be the man his parents had raised him to be. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the hammer on his Colt and holstered it. "You will not die here," Elias said, his voice a low, cold judgment. "You will not have a quick and easy end. You will be taken back to the territorial capital. You will stand trial, not just for the murder of my father, but for treason. You will be stripped of your name, your land, and your power, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a prison cell, remembering the name of the man you killed and the son who brought you to justice." He turned his back on the defeated tyrant and walked away, back toward his friends, back toward the valley he had saved. The war was over. The last entry in the widow's ledger had been written. The journey back from Blackwood Gorge was a somber, weary procession. The surviving rebels, a small band of farmers who had become soldiers, led their prisoners, including the wounded and defeated Silas Blackwood, back toward a valley that was both saved and irrevocably scarred. The elation of their improbable victory was tempered by the heavy reality of their losses. They had won their freedom, but the price had been paid in the blood of their friends and neighbors. The Whispering Willows Valley that they returned to was a changed place. The physical scars of the conflict were everywhere: burned-out barns, trampled fields, and the fresh graves on the hillside overlooking the town. But the deeper scars were in the faces of the people. The easy, trusting peace that had once defined their community was gone, replaced by a more somber, watchful understanding of the world. They had learned the hard lesson that peace is not a gift, but a thing that must be vigilantly guarded and, sometimes, fiercely fought for. Elias Thompson, the quiet farmer who had become a reluctant general, was now the undisputed leader of the valley. He did not seek the role, but it was thrust upon him by the respect and gratitude of the people he had saved. His first act was not one of vengeance, but of justice. He sent a rider to the nearest territorial outpost, not with a boast of his victory, but with a detailed, factual account of Silas Blackwood's treason, a copy of his mother's letter, and a formal request for the U.S. Marshals to come and take custody of the prisoners. While they waited, a fragile new order began to take shape. The families who had stood with Elias from the beginning, McBrides, the Rodriguezes, and Caleb Riley, formed the core of a new and formal council. They worked to restore the damage, to help the families who had been burned out, and to ensure that the valley's resources, particularly the water rights that Blackwood had controlled, were now shared equally among all. The return of Silas Blackwood to the town as a prisoner was a pivotal moment. He was no longer the powerful, feared patriarch, but a broken, wounded old man, his face a mask of bitter humiliation. The people he had oppressed for 2 decades lined the street as he was marched to the small-town jail, but they did not jeer or throw stones. They simply watched, their silence a more profound and damning judgment than any shout could have been. His power, built on fear and illusion, had evaporated, leaving only the pathetic reality of his crimes. When the U.S. Marshals finally arrived, they found not a valley in a state of chaotic rebellion, but a community quietly and deliberately rebuilding itself. They were stunned by the evidence Elias presented, the sheer scale of the illegal arms smuggling operation, the detailed ledgers of Blackwood's criminal enterprise, and the quiet, dignified testimony of the farmers. The trial of Silas Blackwood became a territorial sensation. Held in the capital, it stripped bare the layers of corruption that had festered for a generation. The widow's letter, read aloud in the courtroom, was a voice from the grave that convicted not just one man, but an entire system of greed and impunity. Blackwood was found guilty of murder, treason, and a host of other crimes, and was sentenced to hang. The empire he had built on a foundation of lies was dismantled, his land seized by the territorial government. Back in the valley, the work of healing began. It was slow and difficult. The community had been torn apart by suspicion and betrayal, and knitting it back together required a patience and a grace that came naturally to Elias. He led not by command, but by example. He organized work crews to rebuild the burned-out farms. He mediated disputes between neighbors, his quiet, steady presence a balm on the still raw wounds of the conflict. Caleb Riley, the newcomer who had been the catalyst for the entire affair, found that he was no longer an outsider. He was a hero, a brother, forged in the crucible of shared struggle. He had come to the valley seeking a home, and in the midst of its greatest trial, he had found a family. Elias, in an act of profound gratitude, officially deeded him the old Miller place, not as a sale, but as a gift, a formal acknowledgement that Caleb's roots in the valley were now as deep as anyone's. The two men, the quiet farmer and the orphan, had become the twin pillars of the valley's new beginning, their friendship a symbol of the community's future. The valley was scarred, but from those scars, new seeds of a stronger, more honest community were beginning to grow. In the years that followed the Blackwood War, as it came to be known, the Whispering Willows Valley did more than just heal. It prospered. But it was a different kind of prosperity than the one Silas Blackwood had envisioned. It was not the prosperity of a single powerful man, but the shared, sustainable wealth of a true community. The territorial government, as a reward for their role in uncovering Blackwood's treason, granted the valley a unique charter of self-governance. They formed their own council, with Elias Thompson unanimously elected as its first mayor, a position he accepted with his characteristic, humble reluctance. They established their own sheriff's office, their own school, and a community bank, owned and operated by the farmers themselves. They had fought for their independence, and now they were building a society based on the principles of cooperation and mutual respect that had been forged in the crucible of their struggle. The original widow's letter, the brittle, yellowed piece of paper that had started it all, was given a place of honor. It was framed and hung in the new town hall, a sacred text, a founding document for their new community. It was referred to, with a kind of reverent affection, as the widow's ledger, for it was the document that had finally balanced the moral accounts of the valley. It served as a constant reminder of the price of their freedom, of the secrets that can lie buried beneath a peaceful surface, and of the power of a single, courageous voice speaking the truth, even if it had to wait 20 years to be heard. Elias Thompson grew into his role as a leader, his quiet wisdom and unshakable integrity guiding the valley through its formative years. He married a good woman, the daughter of one of the McBride clan, and had children of his own. He raised his family on the same land his parents had bled for, and he taught his children the stories not just of the war, but of their grandfather, Samuel, a hero who had died for the truth, and their grandmother, Eliza, a hero who had ensured that the truth would not die with him. He was a good mayor, a good husband, and a good father, but a part of him always remained the reluctant gun, a man with a deep, abiding sadness in his eyes. A man who understood the terrible weight of violence, even when it was necessary. Caleb Riley also found the peace he had been searching for. He married the local schoolteacher and, with his own two hands, built a new, larger house on the land that was now truly his. He became a leader in his own right, his youthful energy and optimistic spirit a perfect complement to Elias's quiet gravitas. He was the one who pushed for new irrigation techniques, for a town library, for a brighter future. He had been the spark, and he continued to be a source of light and warmth for the community that had adopted him. His friendship with Elias became the stuff of local legend, a testament to the fact that family is not always a matter of blood, but of shared struggle and mutual respect. The valley became a different kind of place. It was no longer an isolated, forgotten sanctuary. It was a symbol, a story that travelers and newspapermen would tell. It was the story of the valley that had stood up to a tyrant, that had fought for its own soul and won. It attracted a new kind of settler, not desperate prospectors or rootless drifters, but families who were looking for the same thing Caleb Riley had been looking for, not a fortune, but a home, a place to build a life based on something more solid than gold. The scars remained. The people of the valley never forgot the friends they had lost, or the terrible choices they had been forced to make. The memory of the war was a part of their collective identity, a dark thread woven into the bright tapestry of their new prosperity. It made them cautious. It made them vigilant. And it made them fiercely, unbreakably united. They had learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that the most valuable thing they owned was not their land or their water, but each other. The widow's letter had not just revealed a conspiracy, it had revealed the true character of the valley itself. The West grew old. The railroads came, and the telegraph wires, and the open range was slowly, inexorably carved up by barbed wire and property deeds. The era of the great land barons and the private wars faded into the realm of myth and memory. The Whispering Willows Valley, however, remained a place apart. It embraced progress on its own terms, but it never lost the fierce spirit of independence that had been forged in the Blackwood War. It became known as a place of quiet integrity, a community that judged a man not by the size of his purse, but by the strength of his character. Elias Thompson lived to be an old man, a beloved patriarch who passed away peacefully in the same farmhouse where he had first read his mother's fateful letter. He died surrounded by his children and grandchildren, a content man who had honored his parents' legacy by building a community worthy of their sacrifice. Caleb Riley, too, lived a long and full life, becoming a respected elder of the town he had helped to save. He would often take his own grandchildren down to the riverbank, to the spot amongst the willows where he had unearthed the old wooden chest, and he would tell them the story. He would tell them how a quiet valley's peace had been shattered by a secret from the past, and how a group of ordinary farmers, led by a reluctant hero, had stood up to an evil they should never have been able to defeat. The story always ended the same way. He would point to the framed letter hanging in the town hall, the widow's ledger, and he would tell the children that the letter was not just an end to a story, but a beginning. Because the final, open-ended truth of the Whispering Willows Valley was this: the battle had been won, the tyrant had been vanquished, and a just society had been built. But the letter on the wall served as a permanent, silent warning. It was a reminder that history is never truly over, that greed and the lust for power are weeds that can grow in even the most fertile soil. The peace of the valley, as beautiful and as enduring as it had become, was not a final state. It was a promise, a continuous act of remembrance and vigilance. The fate of the West, the letter seemed to whisper from behind its glass frame, would not be written in grand battles or by famous gunslingers. It would be written in the quiet, daily choices of ordinary people. It would be written in the words of forgotten letters, in the promises kept between neighbors, and in the courage of those who, when faced with the darkness, chose to stand up and fight for the light. The smoke had cleared, and the valley was at peace, but the story was not over. The last page of the widow's ledger would always remain unwritten, waiting for the next generation to add their own chapter of courage, integrity, and honor.